July 2nd, 2022 marks the 100th anniversary of the train derailment at Winslow Junction, New Jersey, along the Atlantic City line of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. The site today is vastly different from how it appeared back in 1922, but with rare photographs and original source material, we're able to look back on this disaster and give this story the proper telling that it deserves. In 1922, Atlantic City was turning into the entertainment and party destination that it is today, with new shows, clubs, and entertainment venues popping up weekly, and the first Miss America crowned there only 1 year prior. It was a resort destination for people in the Philadelphia area, who would get there from the big city by taking a ferry across the Delaware River, and in Camden they would board a train called the Atlantic City Flyer, and travel 55.5 miles from there in only 50 minutes. The Atlantic City Flyer was once called the fastest 60-minute train in the world. Now the Midnight Flyer was the late-night red-eye train along this same route, departing Camden at 10:50 p.m. On the night of July 2nd, 1922, it departed 5 minutes late. These 5 minutes are the cause of everything that is about to unfold. The sequence of events of this one gets a bit tricky, so let's try to keep it straight. There are 3 trains involved in this story, all coming through Winslow Junction, which sits by the town of Winslow and is located almost exactly halfway between Camden and Atlantic City, New Jersey. It's nighttime, just past 11 p.m., with scattered rain showers. Overlooking Winslow Junction and directing the trains along their tracks as they pass through the junction is the towerman in the switch and signal tower designated as the WA Tower. The man's name is John DeWald. Towerman DeWald was an older gentleman. I cannot find a precise age for him, but he had been employed by the Philadelphia and Reading Railway for 24 years, working the entire time in the same tower, and was frequently described by them as aged. Our first train in the sequence is a local freight train. It consisted of an unknown locomotive, possibly a Camelback or a Mikado, an unknown number of cars, and a caboose. It is already sitting on a sidetrack at the junction, having been loading and unloading cargo for some time. It signals to the tower that it is ready to depart towards Cape May, and it awaits its clearance. Approaching Winslow Junction from the west, both coming out of Camden, New Jersey, just across the river from Philadelphia, are 2 trains. The first one scheduled is the Midnight Flyer, express train number 33. Number 33 consisted of locomotive number 349, a Camelback, followed by a forward coach, a Pullman parlor car, 3 more coaches, and then a combined passenger and baggage car at the rear. All cars were of steel construction except for the Pullman parlor car. The second train scheduled to reach Winslow Junction, and the third train in our timeline, was extra number 120, a train likely consisting of a Camelback locomotive and an unknown number of empty passenger cars making its way to Atlantic City. So here's what should have happened. Freight number 491 was waiting on the sidetrack, and the Midnight Flyer number 33 should arrive at Winslow Junction at 11:17 p.m. Towerman DeWald would give it clearance to pass through to Atlantic City. As extra 120 approaches, it would be told to stop and wait while Freight 491 moves out and heads southward toward Cape May. And once that has cleared, extra 120 would then be given the clearance and allowed to proceed towards Atlantic City. Here's what messed up. The Midnight Flyer was 6 minutes late, and extra 120 was apparently running ahead of schedule. Now, extra 120 would be arriving at Winslow Junction first, followed shortly after by the Midnight Flyer. Railroad dispatch notified Towerman DeWald of this schedule change, but he must have forgotten. Freight number 491 was signaled to wait, and the tracks were set to allow the Midnight Flyer to continue straight on through to Atlantic City. Once the tracks were set, Towerman DeWald turned his back to the rails and became preoccupied with a phone call with railroad dispatch. The first train that passed through the junction came through at 11:18 p.m., 1 minute after the Midnight Flyer was scheduled to come through. So Towerman DeWald believed that the train that he heard passing through was indeed the Midnight Flyer. It was, in actuality, Extra 120, which, because it was ahead of schedule and the Midnight Flyer was late, had inadvertently swapped places in the timeline with the Midnight Flyer. Once it had passed clear of the junction, Towerman DeWald reported verbally over the telephone in the call with dispatch that the Midnight Flyer had come through. Now, dispatch immediately recognized the error and corrected him and said, no, that was actually Extra 120. But this correction was not acknowledged and apparently missed by Towerman DeWald. He pulled the levers that set the switch to allow freight number 491 to pass through the junction and start making its way towards Cape May. 491 readied, but before it began steaming, the crew of 491 saw another light rounding the bend at Blue Anchor. They stopped and waited, despite the signal for them to proceed, because they recognized the high speed of the incoming train. It was, in fact, the Midnight Flyer soaring in at 75 miles an hour. Now, instead of being able to fly through at high speed on a straight track, as they always do and as they are expecting, the tracks were set to send them on 491's path around a sharp turn to the south towards Cape May. The signals along the rails did indicate to the approaching train that they were about to be routed southbound, so there was still hope that engineer Walter Westcott at the controls of Midnight Flyer number 33 would see the error and bring his train to a stop before they hit the switch. But for some reason, they didn't.
The section of track that number 33 was thrown onto was one of the worst imaginable for a train at that speed. Within a distance of only 30 feet, the track curved 6 degrees to the right, a turn that even slower trains needed to be cautious on. On top of this, the grade descended slightly, meaning the tracks went downhill, giving number 33's wheels an even smaller chance of hanging onto the rails. There's no report that the manual brakes were ever applied. Train number 33 hit the tight curve at nearly full speed when finally the automatic emergency brakes jammed on. The train swayed over but held on for a moment before finally flying off the rails. The engine and the first 4 of the cars flew through the air so far that they landed on a parallel track down the embankment. One passenger, a Mr. Taylor, describes his experience. Quote, "We were traveling at high speed when suddenly there occurred a series of bumps. The next thing I know, the whole car seemed to rise and keel over like a ship in a gale. I was thrown out of the window. That saved my life."
Some of the cars were thrown on top of each other, with the Pullman parlor car landing atop the locomotive and one of the coaches standing upright on top of another. In that instant, engineer Walter Westcott, fireman William Souder, and conductor John Nace were killed, as well as the porter in the Pullman car. As the train flew down the embankment, it took out the power lines for the whole town of Winslow, throwing the whole town into a blackout. Fortunately, the telephone lines did not run on the main power grid, and a 17-year-old telephone operator named Margaret Laughlin, who heard the crash, called for all emergency services to quickly rush to the crash site. Supposedly, Towerman DeWald sent a single dispatch out to Atlantic City, simply saying, "My God, I sent number 33 down the wrong track." Atlantic City responded to him, but by then, DeWald had already gone missing.
Within minutes of the crash, it began to pour, drenching the wreckage as survivors crawled out. Automobiles carrying doctors and nurses arrived on the scene, followed by an onslaught of locals coming out to do what they could to help people out of the wreck. The rain made it harder to see, and the mud made it harder to work. There was no light nearby due to the power being taken out by the train, so the only illumination that the rescuers had was from hand lamps and car headlights. A relief train brought the majority of survivors and the injured into Atlantic City about 2 hours after the wreck, with its passengers on the verge of collapse, and the wounded being rushed off to the nearby hospitals. Towerman DeWald had gone home and locked himself in his house. He was distraught and looking for a means of ending his own life when he was taken into custody, and he was held in custody for the duration of the accident investigation.
The death toll rose. First it was 3, and later in the night it became 6, with some alternative sources reporting as high as 7 to 9 deaths. As many as 89 passengers and crew were injured in the calamity.
The vice president of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad issued a statement, and an investigation was conducted. This investigation report was the primary source for this video, but I can't help but believe that the report was sympathetic to the old man in the WA Tower at Winslow Junction. It did acknowledge his error, and believed that it was the source of the accident, but it did not claim that that alone was enough to cause anything worse than a delay for the Midnight Flyer. The report instead placed the blame on the Midnight Flyer No. 33's engineer, Walter Westcott, pointing out that the signals were visible despite the rain, and he should have noticed that the track was indicated to be turning towards Cape May. However, Engineer Westcott failed to operate his locomotive properly.
Engineer Westcott also failed to blast his whistle on several occasions that he was supposed to. First on approaching the junction, and then at the nearby railroad crossing, and then in acknowledgement of freight number 491's signals, and then finally in acknowledgement of the junction tower's signal. In fact, the man at the controls of the speeding Midnight Flyer appeared to be 100% non-responsive to anything, even neglecting to apply the brakes or cut back on steam in the several seconds of bumping and clanging that the train had before finally being thrown from the rails. Now, of course, it would not be fair to speculate whether or not he had fallen asleep at the controls or had any sort of other issue that might have impaired his controls of the train, as engineer Walter Westcott died in the crash and cannot tell his story.
Wrecking trains were brought in to remove the wreckage and clear the track lines. The section of track that derailed the train was the branch that connected the Atlantic City line to the Cape May seashore line, and several portions of the rail along this branch needed to be replaced after the crash. The Midnight Flyer actually flew off the tracks and landed on the seashore line's trackage below, the line that this branch was ultimately going to merge with. In my videos, I like to do some then and now overlays, but that was next to impossible on this video, as the area is now heavily forested, while in 1922 it was barren and open. However, you can see the rough positioning of the wreck and where it fell down onto the seashore line trackage. In this photograph, the violence with which the Pullman car was thrown on top of the locomotive is evident, as little more than the car's frame remains. This coach car was stood upright by a railroad crane, and while the side facing the camera looks to be in good shape, the destroyed opposite side can plainly be seen through its windows. Locomotive number 349 was repaired and put back into service.
And it is almost certain that even if Towerman DeWald was cleared of all the charges, which I believe he actually was, his career with the railroad had ended.
Today, the tower at Winslow Junction is quiet. There's a parallel line about 200 feet away, and that is a busy line. Freights do move through on occasion, and the New Jersey transit lines fly through at pretty much the same speed as the Midnight Flyer. But that is all on the parallel rail. This section of track, today, is mostly quiet. There's a fleet of old cars nearby, waiting hopefully to be restored one day. On that parallel track, there is a signal tower that stands and is vacant.
The tower behind me is not actually the tower that was involved in the wreck, although people do often mistake it to be that tower. The original tower, the WA Tower, that was there in 1922 is actually long gone, although I understand the foundations still exist somewhere in this forest, so why don't we go take a quick look and see if we can't find that. So I'm going to look for the foundations of that tower up this way, and it's actually on private property. I was given the okay to go ahead and look for it, but if you're going to go hunting for it, I recommend getting that permission as well. This might very well have been that siding that number 491 was sitting on. Could have come right up to here. So the train would have come along this way. This is looking west. So instead of going straight through, they're instead shifted to go that way. Okay, here we're gonna come up on the tower. Dang, that looks so cool. Well, that was quite the startle. This is actually just the foundation of the tower. Would have been stone foundation. Right up there is the railroad. It's pretty much level with the top of the stone structure you see remaining. It would probably have been a wooden tower going up at least 2 stories to the switch room above. And it's from up there that Towerman DeWald would have inadvertently set this chain of events into motion. This is the second rail disaster in less than a year that Philadelphia and Reading Vice President Charles Ewing saw. Previous to this was the Bryn-Athyn train wreck departing Philadelphia to Newtown, Pennsylvania, that killed 27. A video about that wreck can also be found on my channel. The derailment at Winslow Junction is just another wreck. One of many in railroad history. It led to nothing and is ultimately forgotten. The wreck report's only conclusions were that this incident was human error due to unknown circumstances in the cab that somehow made Engineer Westcott unresponsive, and that automatic train control devices would have prevented this, which is something that the railroad was already moving toward at the time. A big thank you to my Patreon supporters who helped make this happen, especially Kaiser Wilhelm II, Trent Greger, Zach Richards, Tom Shavada, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Dakota Charbonneau, Nicholas Musella, Zolt Bognar, Colt Tanik, Eric Morang, History Army Productions, Marlo Perez, and Sophie Baber. Thank you very much for watching.